Well, we're in towards the very end of a sermon series titled How to Neighbor. And this sermon series started off with a really simple question, and that question is this. When Jesus said to love your neighbor, could he have meant your actual neighbor? Like the person that lives next door, or the person across the street, or that person whose backyard goes against your backyard? And the reason we're asking this question is that because throughout the centuries, Christians all over the world have extended the boundaries of what it means to love your neighbors beyond the boundaries of their neighborhood. They've extended it across town, across the state, across the country, across the world. And this is a good thing that we should celebrate, for there is much need in our world. But there's a trap in that. We've been talking about that trap. There's a trap that we can become so focused and so accustomed to loving people at arm's length that we never risk the intimacy of loving those nearest to us. And so we've been asking this question. When Jesus said, love your neighbor, did he mean your actual neighbor? And I think the answer is obvious. Jesus would have said yes. And so today, I want to take us back to the story that got us started, the parable of the Good Samaritan, which can be found in the Gospel according to, say it now, who? Luke, right? All right, like Luke, I'm your father, okay. Right, the Gospel of Luke in chapter 10. Now, if you weren't here at the beginning of this, I made a big deal about trying to get our church to know where to find the story, and here's why. It's great that you hear the story here today, but what I really want for you is that you read this on your own. And what happens when you begin to read these stories on your own to the point where you can actually tell them without the text right in front of you is that the story becomes part of you. It begins to form you. And in that moment, when you're at a crossroads in your life and you need some wisdom, then this story can help you make the right decision. So, Parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke chapter 10. I hope you'll read it for yourself. And it's in this parable that Jesus, he blows up the notion in terms of our boundaries around neighbor. Basically says that a neighbor can be anyone and everyone in need. That's what we talked about in week 1. But today, we're going to look at this parable from a different angle and see something else it has to teach us. So the parable begins like this, or the story. This is not the actual parable, but the story begins like this. A legal expert, who's not like a lawyer in a courtroom today, but more like a religious scholar, a legal expert stood up to test Jesus. He's trying to get Jesus. He's in opposition to Jesus. He says, "Teacher, what must I do to gain eternal life?" Which is a great question. It's a question you ask all the time. You might ask it differently. You might say it like this, that, what's really important in life? What matters the most? Jesus, being a master teacher, he doesn't answer the question for the legal expert. Instead, he says, "What do you think?" I think he says that to us as well. What do you think? What matters most in life? Have you answered that question? You should. You need to. Well, the legal expert, he quotes the Old Testament. He says, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your being, all your strength, and all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus is like, bingo, that's the right answer. That's not what he says, paraphrase. But, he's like, this is the right answer. Good job, you got it. And the legal expert, because he's trying to test Jesus, because he's got his own agenda, he says, well, who's my neighbor? Because, there's a lot of people out there. And, some of those people, they seem worthy of my help. And there's others, if you look at them, they're not really worthy of my help. And so, who's my neighbor? And, some look like me and talk like me. And others, I don't even understand them. Who's my neighbor? How do I decide who I'm going to help? And that's where Jesus begins to answer the question with a parable, a made-up story that's to make a point. So he says, a certain man. Who's the certain man? It doesn't matter. It's a made-up story. A certain man is on his way from Jericho to Jerusalem. He's on this well-known road that is very narrow. You can walk it today. And it's treacherous. And in fact, Jesus says that some thieves come upon this man and they rob the man, they beat him up, and they leave him on the road for dead. A little while later, a priest comes by. And Jesus says that he goes to the other side of the road to avoid the man. And this is Jesus being kind of sarcastic because remember, it's a narrow road. So the man literally has to step over him. the priest comes upon this man who's been beaten up, left for dead, and he passes right by. And then a Levite, and for today's purposes, just think like a church member, a longtime church person, somebody that, should know better. He comes along, and again, Jesus says he passes by on the other side of the road, being kind of sarcastic in his teaching, and he leaves the guy. And then a Samaritan comes along. If you don't know who the Samaritans are, here's what you should know. The Samaritans are the rivals, the no-good-nothings in the Jewish viewpoint. These people never get anything right, and Jesus uses one of these very people, the people we would exclude, as his teaching example. A Samaritan comes by, and he sees the man, and he stops. Here's what Luke says. A Samaritan who was on a journey, he's going somewhere, he's got something to do, came to where the man was, but when he saw him, he was moved with compassion. The Samaritan went to him, bandaged his wounds, tending to them with wine and oil. Then he placed the wounded man on his own donkey and took him to an inn and took care of this man. The next day, he took 2 full days' wages and gave them to the innkeeper. And let's pause it there for a second, because this is a pretty good story so far, isn't it? The Samaritan, he's pretty awesome. But I'm telling you, what happens next is horrible. Absolutely horrible. I can't believe what this guy does next. So I'm glad you're seated, because this is going to blow you away how bad this man is. Look at what he does next. He said, take care of him, and when I return, I will pay you back for additional costs. What a jerk. Right? What a jerk. I mean, this guy's still in need, isn't he? And he helps him up off the side of the road, and he bandages his wounds, and he does all this sort of thing, and he brings them, and he pays for it, and then he just leaves them? Like, where does he have to go that's so important? Jesus doesn't tell us. Maybe he's got a wedding to go to. Maybe he's got a business obligation. Maybe there's a funeral. Maybe he's got a hot date. We don't know. But Jesus ends this story in this way. And of course, you don't think he's a jerk. He's quite remarkable, isn't he? Because he's on a journey, and he allows himself to be interruptible. We talked about that when we talked about time in week 2. He allows himself to be interrupted by the need of somebody else. In your life, do you have enough margin in your life that you're able to be interrupted? Or do you have everything so planned out, you're so tied to your agenda, and you're so busy that even when a need is apparent to you, you just pass right by like the priest or the Levite? Well, this guy, he's on a journey. He's got stuff to do, but he allows himself to be interrupted. And then he goes over to this man, unlike the priest and the Levite. And some of the scholars, they think that the reason the priest and the Levite, that they don't go over to the man who's been beat up and left by the side of the road, is because they're afraid. They're afraid maybe it's a trap. That maybe, that the same thieves are just going to jump out and get them next, right? I mean, there's real fear there. Like, we feel fear sometimes when we see a need. Years ago, when I was in seminary, I worked down at a restaurant in Chicago, and I'd take the Red Line train back home late at night. And I'm riding on the train one night, and these 2 men start to get into a verbal argument. In fact, it's really one man who's the aggressor, and the other guy is much smaller, and he really looks terrified. And I'm sitting there on the train. It's like 11 o'clock at night, and I'm like reading some theology book and connecting with God, and then here's this need right in front of me, and I'm thinking, do I get involved? Because it looks like this guy's about to get pummeled by the other man. And I'm contemplating that, and we pull up to the stop, and the door's open. And the big guy, his back is to the platform where you would get off. And if you've ever been on a train in Chicago, you would know that right before the train's about to leave the station, the doors are about to close, there's a chime to let you know that, like, hey, this thing's about to leave, so be careful. And I'm sitting there going, oh my gosh, this is about to go into a full-on fight. Do I get involved? I don't know if I want to get involved, because, like, maybe I'll get beat up. Maybe the guy has a gun. I mean, come on, right? There's a lot of reasons to fear. And right at the right moment, when the chimes hit, the small guy pushes the big guy out the doors shut, and the train leaves. And I'm like, phew, because, I didn't know what I was going to do. But we're afraid to get involved. And the Samaritan, he gets involved. But then he leaves. And I think the point that Jesus is making to you and I is that the Samaritan gives generously, but he doesn't give endlessly. He gives generously of his time and his energy and his resources, and he's courageous, yet he doesn't give endlessly. And when Jesus is responding to what does it mean to be a good neighbor, he gives us this example. So maybe, just maybe in your life, you are to give generously, but there is a limit. You can't give endlessly. So let's talk about 3 scenarios that you might face if you take serious loving your neighbors, you start to get to know their names, you're intentional about that, you're connecting with them. One thing that you might experience if you start to love your neighbors is that you might experience a neighbor who's in crisis. Maybe it's a financial crisis, maybe it's a marital crisis, maybe it's a health crisis. But if you begin to love your neighbors, people have crises, and they might share their crisis with you. And the thing about somebody sharing a crisis with you, it quickly can become your own crisis, right? You quickly can become overwhelmed by the thing going on in their life that you barely have enough time to attend what's going on in your life. Another scenario is you might find a neighbor who's just plain out irresponsible. You lent them some of your gardening tools, never got them back. They put the garbage out, but they don't put a lid on, so it blew all around the neighborhood. You know, they're irresponsible with their kids. They're irresponsible with the way they keep their house, with their relationships. They're irresponsible when it comes to just some like natural boundary lines that maybe we should have with one another. You love your neighbors. Inevitably, you're going to meet somebody who's irresponsible. A third scenario is that they just might be plain needy. Maybe they're needy because some things happen in their lives and they just have no network. Or maybe they're just, they haven't developed that, but they're the kind of neighbor where like you have a conversation with them in the driveway and they will talk to you until like the sun comes up the next day. Anybody got a neighbor like that? Right? And they're just needy. They're alone and the issues are real, but you don't have the time or the resources maybe for that neediness. But these are 3 things you'll probably encounter. And you could probably add a few more to the list, but you get the picture, right? It gets messy when we start to love our neighbors. So what are we to do? We're to set some boundaries. Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, and we looked at this earlier in the summer in the Free to Be Me series, he says this to all of us. He says, make a careful exploration of who you are and the work you've been given, and then sink yourself into that. Every single one of us is responsible to explore, to put some time and energy into thinking about who am I? What do I value? What is my identity? What am I here for? And then what is my work? What slice of God's creation am I responsible for? Because you're not responsible for all of it, but you are for some of it. And this is about boundary setting. This is about defining ahead of time. Here is who I am and what I can do. So let's talk about some of those boundaries. The first boundary that you'll need to set is around your treasure, around your money. Because show of hands of who has endless amounts of money. Yeah, nobody, right? We all have a bank account and there's a place where that bank account goes into the red. And so you got to make some decisions about what you're going to do with your money, because if you love your neighbors, eventually somebody is going to come to you in need of borrowing money. Years ago, I made a decision. Here's a boundary of mine when it comes to money. I don't loan money out. I don't loan money. Because you know what happened when I've loaned money? I didn't get paid back. And when I did get paid back, it made the relationship distant. And I became bitter and angry. I still give money to people, but I give gifts, not loans. Gifts, not loans. And the person might actually think it's a loan. They're like, here, I'm going to pay you back. I'm like, sure you will. Maybe they will. But in my mind, in my heart, it's always a gift. I won't part with money unless I'm ready to just let it go. That's a boundary for me. And it's helped protect my heart. And it might not be the right boundary for you, but the point is that when it comes to your treasure, you need to make some decisions ahead of time about what you're willing to do. Another one is around your talent. People are going to come and ask you, especially if you're willing to help, to do all sorts of things. And you're gifted in some areas, in other areas, you're not. And so you need to have an understanding, where are my talents? What can I do? What am I willing to help with? Because sometimes you can say yes to something and they get way in over your head. Anybody been there? A third place is in terms of your time. And when we talked about time in week 2, I made the point that, you all think you don't have enough time to love your neighbor and do various things, but actually that's a lie that we tell ourselves because we all have the same amount of time. You get 168 hours a week. Now, we don't know how much time we have left on this earth, but we know how much time we got this week. So it's not a time amount problem, it's a time management problem. It's a priority issue. So you got to think about how you're going to prioritize your time. Yesterday, I was at the installation for our conference minister, Chad Abbott, and I'm so glad that we called this man to be our conference minister. We have like an executive level above pastors. So I'm there, and there's all this clergy are there, Chuck's there, Elaine's there, and it's this great thing, hundreds of people. And I didn't know if I could make it because I've been away from home on Saturdays, several consecutive Saturdays in a row. That's my day home with my family. And so I'm listening to these people speak, and Chad's wife gets up and she says, my husband is a pastor, and his gift is presence. He shows up. And she says, I ask something of all of you, speaking to all of us in the congregation. She says, I ask something of all of you to remember that we need his presence as well. We need him at home. And then this little girl gets up and she says, Daddy, and I was like, out. I left because I was feeling the need to be at home. It was a time issue. We all have to think about our priorities. Are you prioritizing time with God? Are you prioritizing your health, time with your spouse, with your family? The only person that can set those boundaries is you. And Paul says, we all have a responsibility. Here's why this is so important. You know this to be true. Fail to set a boundary, you'll find that you're bitter. I lent him money, didn't pay me back. He asked again, I lent him money again, he didn't pay me back, and he's asking again, and how dare he? And you're bitter. And you think it's the other person's fault that you're bitter. And now I'm bitter and it's his fault. No, it's actually, sorry to break it to you, it's your fault. Because you're responsible for setting your own boundaries. If you don't set boundaries, if you don't take responsibility for that, you're going to end up bitter. It's nobody's fault. So I want to take you to an example of Jesus setting a boundary. And then I'm going to take you to another example from the life of Jesus where he lives within his limits, within his boundaries, and it's amazing what can happen. So I'd love to get into this story in depth, but I got to give you kind of a quick overview just to make this point that is about boundaries. So Luke chapter 8, Jesus comes across this man who is afflicted by demons, is what the New Testament says. Maybe in today's modern kind of language, we'd say that he's got some severe mental health issues. I'm not sure. But what we do know is he's homeless. He's living in a graveyard. He's harming people and harming himself, and he's been this way for a long time. Pretty bleak, pretty desperate situation. Jesus comes along, and he's able to heal this man. And can you imagine how grateful you would be if you've been homeless and self-harming and harming others for so long, and all of a sudden, somehow you're healed? So this man, he's grateful. And here's what Luke says about the man. The man from whom the demons had gone begged to come along with Jesus as one of his disciples. Who could blame him, right? Begs him to come along as one of his disciples, which is a good thing because, we here at Faith United Church of Christ, we're here to help you grow as disciples. We want to lead people to be disciples of Jesus Christ. So here's an opportunity. The guy wants to be a disciple of Jesus. Look what Jesus does. Jesus sent him away, saying, return home. Tell the story of what God has done for you in your neighborhood. But you got a neighborhood, you got a place. And I think that Jesus tells this man to go back home because there's a positive side to this, but also I think Jesus sees something that can happen to all of us when we help somebody. That person, because you help them, they can become attached to you. And they can need more from you and want more from you than you can really give. Which lands us on this point that might be the best point of the message. And I say that because I didn't come up with it. I got it from a book. But here's the idea. We are responsible to our neighbors, not for our neighbors. We are responsible to love our neighbors, to be curious about our neighbors, to take interest in our neighbors, to help them out occasionally financially, or help them out with their kids occasionally. We're responsible to our neighbors, but we're not responsible for them. We're not responsible for their financial health. We're not responsible for their marriage. We're not responsible for their household. We're responsible to them, but not for them. And that's a key distinction. Because I imagine some of you here, maybe all of you, you've reached out to somebody. And that line between doing something for them and helping them out, and then being responsible for them, like controlling the outcomes, how it's all going to go, that's a tension that you've wrestled with. And in this moment, Jesus felt a responsibility to help this man, but he wasn't willing to take on full responsibility for this guy's life. The guy had to learn to stand on his own. In our food pantry, we feel a responsibility to help people with food, but we don't feel responsible to solve all the problems of the people that come our way. One reason for that is because we can't. We really can't. But just because we can't solve all the problems that we're presented with doesn't mean that we can't be responsible to help out in the ways we're equipped to. That's the distinction. One more story from the life of Jesus. This is John chapter 6. This is the feeding of the 5,000. If you've grown up in church, it's a familiar story. In fact, it's in all four Gospels, which is the only story about Jesus that appears in all four Gospels. Isn't that interesting? And I chose this version because of this specific detail about a little boy, and I think it helps make the point. But to set it up, Jesus, he's been teaching, and there's a huge crowd, and it's getting late. And Jesus turns to his disciples, and he says, we need to feed these people. We have a responsibility to do something in this situation. And one of his disciples, Philip, he answers, it would take more than a half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Like the median income in America is something around 50 grand. So, for us to be able to collect 25 grand right now to feed a bunch of strangers, I mean, that would be pretty difficult, right? And that's the context. It'd be more than a half a year's wages to buy enough bread to even one little bite to eat. And then another one of the disciples, Andrew, he chimes in. He says, here's a boy, a little boy, with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. Like, we got this little guy, and he's got a little something, little boy's lunch. Like, we have this, but how far will that go with such a huge need? And you've been in this situation before. You've seen a need, and then you looked at your resources, and then you felt the anxiety of the gap between your resources and the need. And that's where they are. But Jesus, he's not deterred. And so what he says, and I think in the Luke version, organize them into groups of 150, or hundreds and 50. Sit them down into groups. Help them go from being a mob to these groups. Let's organize them a little bit. And then John says Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks for the little bit that they had, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. There's this abundance. Now, in my view, it is absolutely possible that the creator of all earth took this little boy's lunch, somehow miraculously multiplied it to feed all these people. I believe that to be true. God is God. God can do anything God wants. There's also a very logical explanation that to me is also a miracle that might have happened here. Because think about it this way. If they take this little bit of food that they have, the lunch that they have, the little bit of resources they're dependent on, and they risk it to feed just one person, sometimes that courage is infectious, isn't it? And some scholars believe that in this crowd of people, there was 5,000 men. The women aren't mentioned, but there was likely women there. And if the women were there was children there. And if there were children there, those moms packed lunches, right? Because moms always pack goodies for their kids, right? We never leave home without something for Jack. And so there was food in that crowd. And that decision to share that food sparked and inspired everybody else. Whatever the case is, we're told that extra is collected. And here's the idea that I want you to just let seep in for a moment. That is that God can do more with your little than you could do with a lot. Meaning that if you are willing to give the little bit you have to whatever God is calling you to do to that person, that need that you feel compelled about, God can do more with that little bit than you could do if you had a whole lot. If you were on your own and you just had all the resources in the world, God can do more with the little bit you're willing to give up than you would be able to do if you just had everything. The people, they're amazed by this. As we would be, right? Like if we're all hungry and somebody fed us, we're happy, Last week, Steve fed us, we were all happy. It was great. And so Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Knowing that he took responsibility to help them with a need, but now they want him to be responsible for all their needs. They want to make him king. Hey, this guy just fed us. Why don't we make him king? He can take care of all of our needs. Jesus was not willing to do that. And so again, not the first time in his ministry, again, he had to assert a boundary about what he was willing to do, help generously, and not willing to do, help endlessly. But within those limits, within those boundaries, isn't it amazing the impact that Jesus had on his community? And within your limits, isn't it amazing the impact that God can have on the people around you? Which leaves us with the bottom line for my message today. If you'll learn to love within your limits, God will love beyond them. If you will learn to give the little bit that you have, you'll be amazed at what God will do through that. And some of us can tell those stories. A lot of us can come up here and be like, I didn't really think it was going to work out. I didn't really know how we're going to do this. I mean, pretty much every month at the food pantry, there's a moment where we're like, are we going to have enough food? Are we going to have enough volunteers? We don't quite know. And then it's amazing what happens. If you love within your limits, you do have limits. You've got to set boundaries or you'll become bitter. But if you learn to love within them, God will love far beyond them. Let us pray. God, you ask us to be part of the good news, to be citizens of your kingdom, to be part of this gathering, this movement, the way of Jesus Christ. You don't ask us to do it alone. You don't ask us to take responsibility for all of it. You don't ask us to live beyond our limits. God, I ask that you would be with every person here, that they'd be willing to be stretched, but that they would stay within the limits that they have. And know, God, that if they will just give the little bit, even when it feels insignificant, like a little boy's lunch, it's quite significant what you can do through those who trust you and are willing to follow you. In Jesus Christ's name we pray.